The big reason for tonight is this is our history speak. This is in honor of Bill Goodwin. So we have a very special guest to give us a wonderful history speech tonight. He promised to be under 2 hours, so hold that thought. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest speaker. He's got a bachelor's degree in agriculture economics from Virginia Tech. He's got his DVM from the University of Georgia, so he's a bulldog. He's also got a master's of science and pathology from the University of Wisconsin, so that's my hometown, so I love Wisconsin. He's had various occupations from the Oregon National Primate Center, the MSC Primate Center, Medical College of South Carolina, and obviously the Oregon Health and Sciences University. I'm not going to steal any of his thunder, but he maybe write a few little fun things that he got to do. He helped write the first grant for the breeding corrals in Oregon. He live caught young feral rhesus in India, so different times, that's going to be interesting. He visited and arranged importation of baboons from Kenya to the Oregon National Primate Center. He helped develop Morgan Island for the FDA in their rhesus polio program. He's lectured in China on rearing monkeys for their polio vaccination program. He also, interesting thing on a phone conversation about a week or so ago, he attempted to write a grant for a fully automated greenhouse for housing non-human primates. Obviously, that was a failure at that time. However, it's fully functional now at the Toronto Zoo. So somewhere he was a success. But the reason he's here is that he served on the organizing committee for the first APV workshop in 1973, attended by that time by 43 veterinarians. We now have roughly 250 people at this workshop every year. This is our 47th year. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Art Hall.
Well, there's one funny thing I thought about when I came in tonight. When we had our workshop, it was about the third workshop in Portland. I invited Bernie Trum, who was the director of the New England Primate Center, to speak to us about cagings. That was one of his subjects that he had some knowledge of, and I'd invite him to come to our meeting. And he said he would, and he flew out, and when he came to the door and he saw there were like 40-some veterinarians there. Now, he's a veterinarian and director. He left. He didn't come in and enter into the discussion. And I tried to call him, and it was just amazing. Our gal at the door who was just checking everybody in says that once he saw the crowd, he just turned around and left. So actually, now the last time I was here, there were like 40 or 50 of us, and the same thing hit me. I thought, gosh, now I see what Bernie was thinking about. Okay, well, this did start, the monkey business started way before we got involved, I think, because what I was trying to do is give you a little timeline of what goes on before we got started. And I sort of put it in between the 40s and the 60s, there were a lot went on. We had, if you think about it, Yerkes was in Orange Park, Florida, and we had Brown University had a large prosimian colony that was doing dermatology research, looking at all different skins and development of skins and different primates. And then we had the Harry Harlow Lab in Madison, which was growing in behavioral research. The CDC, now there's another, I've got so many stories, like you said, I could be here 3 hours. The CDC was developing a polio vaccine at that time, and they had a massive amount of monkeys going through Hilton Head. Now, Hilton Head wasn't a resort in those days. And at the Primate Center in probably mid-60s, I had a small clinical lab where we did our hematology and microbiology and all. The hematologist's uncle came to visit, and he said he wanted to see the Primate Center because he was a pilot in the 50s, and he flew from New Delhi to Hilton Head at least 3 or 4 times bringing monkeys. And the stories he had of how it smelled on that airplane, and they would go down 10 to 12 feet off the ocean and clean the plane out, and if any animal had died, drop it out into the ocean. So unbelievable to meet somebody that had done that. And yet, when I got to Yemisi and lived there, Nobody knew about that. But I did find a facility. There was an old ghost building that looked like dog runs in had a main building with dog runs. Okay, so anyway, the military was early starting in those days with the high altitude flying. And then, of course, shots to the moon, space. And one time I was asked to go to Wright-Patterson to. No one in those early days knew the hematology, blood chemistries of the animals very well. It wasn't well documented, and we did a lot of that at Oregon. That was one of our primary objectives, was to get all that data. And they were having some difficulty with high altitude, and they totally overlooked lung mites. They weren't screening for lung mites, and so it appeared probably the animals that had the difficulty breeding were lung mites. So anyway. Then we move into the 60s and the 70s, and basically then NIH really became active. They were funding extramural programs and intramural programs. Extramural would be contracts with universities or grants to universities for primates, and then the contracts would be they would actually fund like research. We had one of the largest ones at Lytton Bionetics, the atherosclerosis contracts. And that Bowman Gray was another one in those days that got some of the, Chris, sitting there watching me, watch you, yeah. Chris, they'd go in and work on Saturday, but there wasn't any techs there, so we'd sit around and talk, remember? And I was a visitor, and I got to experience that. They were kind enough to put me on the faculty to do nothing, right? Well, what we were in Yemassee were the control animals for the atherosclerosis animals on the test diets. You know, you had high, low, medium cholesterol diets, and then our animals that lived on the island and in cages were controls. So that's how I got into your business. Also, when we started Morgan Island, I needed a behaviorist to help. What the heck are we going to do and what's going to happen? So Dave Taub was behaviorist at Bowman Gray School of Medicine, and he came as my partner. The deal was I'd already done all the writing and got the grants and got the contract, and before it could be funded, you had to have a behaviorist on board and submit, not before it's funded, before you can submit it. So Dave came down and helped write the behavioral part and the capturing part and how we would, select animals for the polio vaccine studies. And so he helped me with that, and then eventually we got the contract, and then he came and worked as the director of the island. So that was it. We had a great, opposite of what Eric said this morning, I had a great relationship with the behaviorist. We were we had to be partners. Okay. Anyway, in the 60s and 70s, there were several other primate center development. In 63, there were at least 6 primate centers developed then. So what I'm getting up to, most of the say, 70s, all these projects were run by the PI, the principal investigator, or head technician, or an MD. Just a few of them had veterinarians. And so what was happening, you're building a research unit, and it's getting to a critical mass. And we weren't talking to each other in those days. I mean, we couldn't. We didn't have cell phones. We couldn't text or email. We didn't have desktop computers. Computers were mainframe. At the end of the day, I'd have to sit and type using Fortran programming and put all the data on cards. Then if I wanted to know how many diarrheas I treat each month or how many pneumonias we had, I'd take the stack of cards and then write another program. And then the answer would come out. You had 53 97s and 24 83s. It was all code. So we didn't have, so we couldn't talk, we couldn't share information. And everybody's data probably was, in those days, was on hand manual labor. Just write down notes and you couldn't add up anything. So anyway, given that background, we faced all these issues and we weren't organized. We weren't talking to each other, and I think you guys will recognize some of these. The biggest problem we had is our monkeys were all wild caught. And it wasn't like anything you saw today, where at the source it was almost the opposite. Here you're at the source now, you have a quarantine and you're trying to keep them separate and get the animals cleaned up. When we were in business in those days, they were getting them sick. They'd trap them in the woods, put them in gang cages. So if there's one animal with TB, by the time they got to deli, there'd be 6 animals with TB. And if you had one infectious disease, like a diarrhea with Campylobacter or something, by the time they got there, they'd all have diarrhea. So that was one thing I noticed when I went over. We went over and took them and caught them in the woods with single cages, kept them under a tent, TB test them, fed them this, and like you said, a homemade diet. None of them had diarrhea, had no TB when we got home, and I think out of 200 twice, 400 animals, we lost maybe 2 or 3. And I think Roy did the same thing at Davis a year or 2 later, and he said he didn't lose any using that technique. So that's basically what you're doing now by having the quarantine in the country of origin. So what we were faced with was a limited supply of monkeys in about 1970. India stopped exporting monkeys over some argument. It was political, but they used our Army radiation research to stop exporting monkeys. So here we're faced with no monkeys, so we have to raise our own. So that was the reason for the going to India to catch monkeys for our grants, and also to have the corrals. There's so many things to talk about. The reason we succeeded with the corrals was we were gifted a troop of 40 macaca fuscata from Maera, Japan troop is what it was called. They all came in, 40 of them. We built a 2-acre corral, and we had engineers help us so that they could withstand over 100-mile-an-hour wind. But other corrals we didn't copy because this is another reason we needed an AVP. There were 3 systems of corrals that we looked at, and in every one of them, the monkeys escaped. And so no one was looking to improve or get together. You could really see that. Probably the best ones were in, I want to say, Sabana Seca down in Puerto Rico. They had the grant that we ultimately got, or contract we ultimately got to Morgan Island. But CDC built 1/4-acre corrals, put the nuts of the bolts on the inside of the corral, made the fence was straight up with wire for ventilation at the bottom, and the monkeys would just climb right out. They released the monkeys and they're all out. Isn't that? So anyway, our corral is 10 degrees inward, 11 feet high, because we did some math. They can only jump 10 feet. The young athletes, when they get about 4 years old, put a little weight on, they jump about 8 feet. And the only escapes that I recall was I walked in one day to check them, and this young male had been looking at me like I thought he was going to attack me, but what it was, he jumped on my shoulder and then jumped on. I thought I had a buddy, And believe it or not, he jumped back in, He looked around and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Well, we had a whole troop of howler monkeys get out at the Primate Center once. What a mess that was. We had a howler monkey killed by a train. Some guy brings in a corpse where a train ran over it. Had high school students came in with his leather jacket, the leather jackets they have. He brought us a perfectly healthy howler monkey in his jacket. He'd caught it in an apple orchard. Just great stories. In fact, you guys probably been in, maybe you haven't been in on any of these things, but we had some rhesus get out, and they went clear to Hillsborough, and there was like a football game. There'd be the yay, boo. The people didn't want us to catch them, and so they were cheering for the monkey. So all this animal rights issues you don't see that when your monkey gets loose, isn't it? And I do remember the slide today, or the thing today about the baboon loose in San Antonio. That did hit the news, just like she said. It was everywhere. So anyway, the big issue that hit us right off, and you had to be organized to do something about it. Right about those years, old tuberculin, Knox old tuberculin, was used in humans, and PPD had just come out. And PPD is a lot cleaner, a lot neater. It has a specific amount of tuberculin protein in it, so it doesn't cause untoward reaction in the human skin. So the manufacturers, we're just learning that old tuberculin really works in primates, and the manufacturer now is not making it anymore. And as individuals, when you'd call the company, you could just feel we had no clout. As one user, 400 monkeys, we're not going to make old tuberculin for that. And that, I think, might have been one of the pivotal issues that got us, we got to get together and be organized. So, and all of that came along a little bit just about the same time as Marburg disease broke out in Germany, in Stuttgart, in Marburg. And that scared the hell out of everybody. So we didn't know what to do about that. So we thought we better get organized and quit having these just phone conversations and missing a lot of information. So we lobbied NIH, which had, and our superiors were all DVM PhDs. See, Dennis Johnson, Leo Whitehair, there were a number of them. And we got nowhere. What we were asking for was just funding for the veterinarians that were NIH funded or under contract to put together something we could get together nationally and meet. And just, they all agreed that'd be a good idea, but nothing happened until Bill Goodwin came. So Bill Goodwin had an affinity for veterinarians, and it was kind of interesting. He's a really quality guy. What he had was a PhD in medical entomology, and he had worked as a public health official in Libya and Haiti under, basically his job was mosquito control for malaria. And he had worked basically as a veterinarian in these foreign countries for about 6 or 8 years when he got reassigned for the last 4 or 5 years of his career where he could retire. So when Mike Keeling and I and Tom Butler, it was about 4 or 5 of us, said, we got to get together and we have no money. I was just treating diarrhea. That's all I did. We worked in the quarantine. I think if any of you can remember those days, it was just awful. we primarily, hey, by the way, talking about diarrhea, that was one of the questions that you guys asked here on one of the deals. So we had 2 treatments. One we called the atomic bomb. It was 4% tincture of opium, which is paregoric. Mix that with a little atropine, and then you pour in some kaopectate and you stir it, and there'll be a little bit of steam come off. So it looked like a witch's brew. And so it would stop diarrhea just like that. But when you stop treating it, the diarrhea is still there. So we weren't really attacking the root cause, okay? So here's the one that really worked, and it worked best. Chlormicetin, not palmitate for the youngsters, but chlormicetin, succinate. You can't treat the Shigella, Clamphamella, what is it? Campylobacter. You can't treat those after they have the diarrhea. They don't seem to respond so well. You can't treat it, obviously, but you can't wait till you culture it, and you can't wait till it's got blood in it. What you do, you ask the techs to always look at the stool, and when they're normal, they're round on both ends, firm on both ends. But the minute you get the ice cream cone curl, or you get a little bit of mucus at the, right at the last, as the door shuts, it puts a little mucus on it. That's when you start the chloromycete and succinate. And you do it for 3 or 4 days, and if that curl gets better and it goes back to normal, you can stop. You don't have to treat for 7 to 10 days. Now, I don't understand how a bacteriostatic antibiotic can do that, but it did. That was probably our most successful, most common treatment of diarrhea in the quarantine. There was one that I tried, but I didn't really do it I didn't have a lot of effort in it. The gastrointestinal guys at OHSU said, you got a big problem here, but if it were me doing it, we would normally give non-absorbable sulfa and a little steroid and treat it like colitis. And I did a few, but I gave it an honest try. But that was the 3 treatments that we had in our bag for that. And then, of course, there's ampicillin, and there's a whole number. I always thought that the flora in the bowel was the reason that gets disturbed, and you get too many Klebsiellas or not enough whatever, and you misbalance the gut, and that's one reason that you have these diarrheas. But then there's the behavioral, the cage size, SIV, when was the animal weaned? I mean, geez. So diarrhea, it'll be around forever, guys. It was like the Barsky granuloma. When we had the APV in our facility in Portland, we kept getting monkeys in from primate imports, and they'd have I always thought it was a swollen lymph node. And so one day we got to biopsy that. So we opened up 2 or 3 of them. It's kaopectate. It looked like pus. You had to look at it to see that really wasn't pus. So what Dave Barsky, the vet there, was doing, he'd designed a needle, with a ball on the end, and then he'd bend it just right. So he'd stand there, and the guys would bring the monkeys by. So when he came out to the meeting in Portland, I'd gotten a statue of a monkey, and it had a ball right here. And we presented him with a Barsky granuloma from our animal, from our APV for keeping us all in business. We had a guy keeping us in business treating monkeys. So that was just a cute thing. Like I told you, there's 1,000 of these things. Okay, the big one after Marlborough was we're at Davis with a director's meeting one day. Now we weren't thoroughly organized yet. We learned that Davis had a hemorrhagic disease. And I'm getting monkeys from Davis like monthly, and we didn't know this. Well, you remember you had the director, Schmidt, the dictator Schmidt. In fact, that's a story. Jack Vanderlip, when he came to work in Portland to do the VA job at our place, he teared up about working at Davis under Schmidt. And so some of these veterinary versus director or versus senior PIs is really serious. I mean, it does affect your career, and it does affect your behavior. But Mike Keeling did the same thing at Yerkes. Jeffrey Bourne was the director that was, I want to say, was he a behaviorist? I think he was, but boy, Mike left. And when he told the story why he had to finally leave, it was really sad. He just hated to leave, but he can't live in conflict. So that's what we tried to do to get together. Remember now, when we were young and just starting all this, we had all the responsibility of the colony and no authority to do anything. Nobody worked. At least in our jobs at primate centers, all the employees worked for the director. I didn't have anybody work for me, and so it was kind of hard to clean the act up under those circumstances. So believe it, we've really come a long way. Medical schools are really good because they have a hierarchy in medicine. So when you're the vet at a medical school, you're generally in charge of your program. And you have to be responsible for it too. So, okay, we always had to cloud a monkey B. I don't hear that mentioned anymore. Herpes B, remember George Ward had a couple of his employees die, and one of the employees' wife died. It was the same story as Marburg disease. A guy goes in, the wife goes in to visit the Marburg patient in Marburg, and then she gets Marburg, she got the hemorrhagic disease. So she had had some sexual contact with him while he's in the hospital being treated. It's unbelievable that you can hear this. So anyway, this happened with George Ward down in Pensacola at the Navy Research Facility, only it was herpes B. That was a sad one because I think those patients actually responded to treatment, to the antiviral drugs, but when they tried to wean them off, like 2 or 3 years later, they came back with symptoms. And if you've seen the pathology of that herpes B and how it ascendingly affects your spinal cord, it's a bloody spinal cord. It's really terrible. So, but then I don't know what you guys are doing now, but we almost just forgot about it. We just started wearing protective clothing and figured 10, 15% of the monkeys are positive, or think of them, all of them as positive. So anyway, that was one. Then we had the mysterious Pox disease. I call it Pox 1011. That was the number of the monkey that we diagnosed it on first. It spread to our animal caretakers, and they got viremia and would almost die. Their skin would be reddish color. Happened to Davis. No, it happened after Davis after it happened to us. So you all tried to give us hemorrhagic disease, and we gave you pox. So, and we would contact Davis. We were good friends at Davis. So, anyway, listen to this story. So, this is starting to spread between the people and the monkeys, and it was in the Jap macaque corral. Then it started hitting some of the rhesus. So I thought, I've got to be pasteur. That's just what Eric says. We veterinarians, we're self-confident. And we took immunology, and I made a vaccine against E. coli in microbiology. So I looked up how to do this and got some lab techs to help me, and we ground up the lesions and formalin and did some passages and vaccinated all our monkeys, and it stopped it. Then the public health department comes out and says, do you realize you could have made that more infectious? When you start screwing with a virus, they can get worse instead of better. So we thought we'd done something great, and then we got criticized for it. Okay. The other one that I never did solve was Strongyloides, and it had some backstories. I think the first squirrel monkey I treated with a bad case of Strongyloides, she died. Turns out, so I immediately called down to med school, my backup, and they said, oh yeah, in humans, when you have strongyloid infections, they put you on about a 7-day steroid therapy and maybe antihistamine too, and then they treat you. Because you kill all those microflora and those nematodes at once, and there's an allergic response in many people to the protein. So we learned that because a couple of vets in town, we had pet stores in those days with monkeys. So I was getting stories that they would go in and treat one of the monkeys in town with ivermectin, and the darn thing would die. And we stopped that. We never lost another after using that protocol. Okay? All right, here were a couple of other funny ones. It's hard to believe we don't communicate, and that's why we're here tonight. PCBs in the sealants that were in paints around the country. We started seeing chloracne. We saw it at our place. I couldn't believe it. This was another behavioral veterinarian argument. The behaviorist got the money to put in about 4 monkey runs, indoor, outdoor, and of course, he knew what he was doing, and the vet was to stay out of it. You can't talk to the contractor. This is my business. So I did. Well, actually, pretty much had to. So those monkeys started vomiting in about 6 months when we put them in. Got little pimples all along their eyelashes. That was the funniest thing I've ever seen. Little pustules at the tip of at the root of the eyelash. And then hair would fall out. I'm telling you, we looked and scratched, what the heck is it? And one of our pathologists at the center said, that's like X disease in cattle. We actually studied that, where they'd lick the oils off the farm equipment and have chloracne. Well, that's what it was. And there must have been 2 or 3 cases. So Roy and I were on a round-the-world trip to see all the primate centers in the U.S., and we ended up in a USDA facility right south of Miami. Empty, nothing there. Well, guess what? A toxicology USDA facility built dog runs for monkeys, sealed it with a product that had full of PCBs. They had experienced the same thing. Plus, they had a particular wire that had the zinc toxicity and had several of these places that went with dog runs actually had 2 conditions going at once. We call it the blonde baby syndrome, where you have zinc toxicity. Zinc competes with iron, and then you get anemic. I'm not quite sure the mechanism why the hair turns pale, but it loses its pigment. So then, something you probably never see anymore was we had a lot of squirrel monkeys and spider monkeys that had D3 deficiency. They would fracture, they would walk over to get something to eat, and their leg would break. And a lot of pets in town, I got a lot of calls. I probably treated more monkeys in Portland than I did at our place, because we got on it. We'd I was thinking about 100 units of vitamin D3 on a sugar cube every day and just hand it to them. That was another issue that went on about TB, whether to treat them with isoniazid or to test and slaughter. And I was involved with 2 colonies that we did treat. Bionetics had a large primate cholesterol study, and these females, there were a couple of positives that showed up, and there weren't enough money. There were like 200 monkeys, and we couldn't afford to kill it because it was part of the statistical numbers that we were looking for. So we put them all on isoniazid. Harry Harlow, before I'd gotten there, they put them on isoniazid. They just screw it. We're not going to kill our monkeys that have been in a 10-year testing program, or a motherless mother. We've put all this invested time in. So we used isoniazid, put it on a piece of bread in a little jelly spread. It was a vitamin spread, and they ate it. So there is an end to this story. So when Bionetics gave me all those monkeys at the end, the controls all came to us to Yemassee to release on Morgan Island. And those monkeys, there were Goodwin lesions in a few of them. There were a number, because I radiographed them before we went out, and none of them were active. That isoniazid had actually cured those monkeys that had TB. So that was something we stayed with test and slaughter, but actually, if you treat it with a good isoniazid, streptomycin type protocol, it will heal. Those little things were all circled by granulomas and giant cells. So, like I say, everything I say, I can. All right, the last thing was regulations. Boy, you guys can't believe the creep that started. There weren't any regulations when we were. We spent hours on our own working on the cage size. Oregon, we designed probably the best cage that you could design. It was a 4-unit cage where you could pull out the dividers and make it a 2-unit cage. It was glass in the middle so that monkeys could see each other. If they liked each other, you could pair them, put it back, put another one in the other side. You could give them the whole cage. Here comes a rule. You got to sanitize at 180 degrees a cage every 30 days or something. Jeez. We couldn't move those cages. We'd roll them out onto the edge. We had a cement pad. We'd roll them out and pressure clean them with a pressure cleaner with ammonium disinfectant, quinine ammonium. We didn't use phenol because it would kind of screw up you might cause some etching. Well, anyway, we had to get rid of those. We slowly had to get rid of those because we couldn't sanitize them. And now we're going back to that system where you cage with cat, with no, okay. But we spent hours. You may not know what went into making a monkey cage, those hanging cages, the size of the wire. Like the first cages we had, the wire was too small in diameter, so the biscuits would all fall through. So we kept getting them bigger and bigger until finally they wouldn't fall through till they had eaten half of it, or cracked it. Then they'd fall through. The monkeys could escape on those original hanging cages because they learned they could reach out, and that little guard, I think that came from our primate center. Our techs were saying, all you need is put a little guard over that latch. And then the bar for the catching of the transfer boxes, that was basically a Harry Harlow idea where we'd go up. They pretty much invented that catch box. It's aluminum, and you put on the cage and jump them in and jump them out. Here's an interesting story about that NIH hemorrhagic disease. They could take a monkey with hemorrhagic disease and a monkey without. They'd never been in contact. Put the monkey with hemorrhagic disease in the transfer box, let it sit in there for about 5 minutes, put it back in the cage. Then take the monkey that had never been exposed to hemorrhagic disease, put it in the transfer box, same time, put it back in the cage, and it would transmit. That just seems unbelievable. They did that a number of times in their study to see direct contact transmission. And I don't know how those animals were spreading it, maybe in the urine, probably any body fluid. Okay, so anyway, here come the regulations. And we had the Silver Springs break-in, and along with the regulations came neurophysiology restrictions, and we got the Animal Welfare Act started. The guide now started giving us things that we had to do. USDA made some regs on primates. NIH has its own regs on primates. And it just was a rapidly changing field all of a sudden. And those of us that were around, I'm not sure when all that stopped. It seems like the creep has stopped now from what I see, but it isn't stopping. Well, the other one was PETA started on us, and then my favorite character was Shirley McCreel. And when I moved to Yamasee, she lived 30 miles from Yamasee. And she protested every weekend to the Medical College of South Carolina, where we were doing the hip joints and the teeth. We were doing hip replacement research with the new materials, and my role in it was I would radiograph and help with the surgery. But this is another grace. We didn't have equipment to measure the parameters that the researchers needed. It was a German orthopedic company funding it. But I found an x-ray machine in a small town in South Carolina just outside Yamasee, but it was in the emergency room. So I cut a deal with those guys, and we'd pack our baboons over. They'd give me a call, hey, there's nobody sick. And it'd be like 2 PM, and we'd anesthetize a couple baboons and run them over and do our hip measurements. And then we'd order the hips based on our measurements, and they fit every time. So it was a German engineering project, so it was going to work pretty much. Then we had we were testing several titanium products for dental implants. And I had a hip replacement this winter, and I called back to the PI that I worked with there, and he said, you wouldn't believe the research we're doing now. He says, we work with Clemson, and they have Bluetooth in the hip joint that you can read out how it's doing, like the angles. So that's pretty spacey. You have a Bluetooth, and you talk to your hip. I guess what they were probably thinking, they'll put it into run mode, walk mode, park. So anyway, that's pretty much covered it. I had a great career and traveled a lot and got to see a lot of things. Probably I thought I might share with you some really poignant moments that make you really glad you were doing what you're doing. I was down visiting Bernstein. I can't remember his first name. A psychologist at Yerkes. Bernstein was his last name. And I was out at the Lawrenceville facility, and a brand new baby gorilla was born, and she was in the outside area, the fenced around. And so I was sitting there having a lunch, and I sat beside the wire, and she came over and handed me her baby through and she was so proud. And so I groomed it a little bit. I didn't take it, I just groomed it a little bit. And it was amazing that sense you get when something like that happens to you. And it happened to me again, and it sounded like what Eric, or I think it was Chris, was talking about behavior this morning, where you don't make eye contact. Remember she's talking about you put the threatening human in the cage? Well, I had the great idea, go out on the cliff on the Rift Valley and watch all the giraffes come out. You know, the animals come out in Kenya in the evening, and so when it cools off. So I left Jim Else and went out and sat on my spot, right? And the biggest troop of baboons I've ever seen comes walking out of the woods and went all around me, even sat beside me. And those big friggin' males, they could eat you. I mean, what came to mind was, I was trying to get a drill baboon to move over in the cage, so I took a broom handle and just move over a little bit, you know? He took that thing and he went, so I'm thinking, now I'm the broom handle. But it turns out I'm Chris's threatening human. I didn't look at those guys. And the young males would come over and kind of, you know how they fool with you like on cow? How they come over and just mess with you. And pretty soon the moms got them all and they just moved on. But they were moving somewhere. And that's an interesting feeling to have be in their environment and just don't look at them. That was my rule. So anyway, the bottom line is, I think to be successful, you have to be on the PI's side. You know, you have to work for the PI and the animal and try to make a successful project in whatever you're doing, because you can't really put down the PI sometimes it just happens that way, but you really need to be the advocate for the researcher and the research that's being done and try to get it done correctly. And then in closing, I'll say a couple things about Bill Goodwin. Bill and I got into the primate business same year. 1963, I went to Wisconsin and had an office beside Harry Harlow's office. He went to NIH as one of the team. Now, I didn't see him probably for 5 or 6 years because he was probably in the background, not necessarily working with the Primate Center program. But then when he retired about 15 years later, he came to Oregon and was assistant to our director. And he was there to help us younger faculty learn how to do a better job at writing grants, working up proposals that were more meaningful to NIH and not doing something way off that you could not get funded. So that's when I wrote the grant for the monkeys in the corral. He sat down with me for 2 or 3 days and he showed me how to write, what the reasons we were doing it for, what to cover, what not to cover, and be specific. And we got it. I mean, you had my name on it, but he really helped me with that. And after that, he did something for me. Like, I don't think I ever had a year in my career after that I didn't have a contract or a grant. And I don't know if you guys remember, I don't know how it works with your institutions, but when you're a veterinarian, the promotions were all by the way the PhDs get promotions. How many articles have you written? How many grants do you get? Well, I'd worked there probably 5, 6, 7 years, and we just weren't, as vets, getting promotions. We were considered diarrhea readers. And so that was going to be my out. You know, I'm going to get Bill to help me get going. But I'm telling you, that really did change my life. So he was an interesting guy. It turned out his mother's farm and my mother's farm, a family farm, are probably 25 miles apart. We're 4 miles from Monticello, and he's about 19. And when I was 10, my cousin and I delivered papers to Monticello, and I'm thinking, I probably delivered papers to Bill Goodwin's family, when I was a kid and didn't know it. All gravel roads. So he had a little connection with me from back there. We shared stories of life in Charlottesville, Virginia in those days. Both my grandparents were from Charlottesville on my mother's side. And that's what I think that was his mother's side, that he was from Charlottesville. So anyway, he was a special guy. He, listen to this, if you hadn't read this, Tom Butler did a great job for Bill. Bill, when he got out of high school, we were in World War II, and he joined the service and was a tank commander in the 4th Armed Division of Patton, and landed at Utah Beach. And immediately, within probably several weeks, had to go into the Battle of the Bulge in Ardennes to fight off that last German attack, that bloodiest battle of the war. And he was a tank commander in that. Now, another interesting thing, my dad went in about the same time Bill did. He was a tank commander. I think when you're born down there by Fort Knox, in Knoxville, you're a tank commander. All those Southern guys were put in tanks. But my dad went over and was with MacArthur when they took back the Philippines, and was in the first group of guys that went into Japan to set up MacArthur's office. So it was kind of funny how we talked about these stories. He was in Europe, and my dad was over in Asia. So that's about it, I think. I really did appreciate it. Gave Bill an honor because he was particularly proud of the APV accomplishment. He was proud of the way he had done a good job in the Foreign Service of knocking out infectious diseases and parasitic diseases. And then he had another one. He taught at Clemson for a while, and he developed the rubbing board to get that parasites off of the animals out in pastures, and he was really proud of that. So. Now, this is neat. You put his name on the dinner speakers. Okay, that's it.